Hello and welcome. I am Juliet Rizzo, and I will be talking with Lou Danielson and Larry Wexler from the Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, about the final Part B regulations implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. We'll be talking about the provisions relating to early intervening service and response to scientifically based interventions. Welcome, Lou and Larry, and thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Juliet.
Could you talk about response to interventions and early intervening services and how they relate to each other?
Response intervention, or RTI, is mentioned in the regulations in conjunction with the identification of children with specific learning disabilities. However, OSEP has been funding research into RTI for several years. Various implementation projects have collected substantial amount of data around the responses of children with disabilities to scientific, research-based intervention. This has given us a lot of information about how to support children who are having difficulty learning, primarily in reading, but also in math and science.
On the other hand, the concept of early intervening services is completely new in the statute. The idea is to provide preventive services to children who have not been identified as needing special education and related services, but may be experiencing some problems. The target group is children in kindergarten through grade 12, with an emphasis on children in kindergarten through grade 3.
The first question in my mind, and probably others' minds as well, is what is considered scientific, research-based intervention?
We're working on a definition that would be more specific to the needs of children with disabilities. Until then, we are working from the definition of scientifically based research in the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB. Scientifically based research, according to NCLB, is research that involves the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures to obtain reliable and valid knowledge relevant to education activities and programs. It includes several components. I think between us, Larry and I can give them all to you. I know that this kind of research employs systematic empirical methods that draw on observation or experiment.
It also involves rigorous data analyses that are adequate to test the stated hypotheses and justify the general conclusions drawn. It relies on measurements or observational methods that provide reliable and valid data across evaluators and observers, across multiple measurements and observations, and across studies by the same or different investigators. In other words, the practice is measurable, achieves what it purports to achieve, and the results can be replicated by the same or different investigators.
This research is evaluated using experimental or quasi-experimental designs in which individuals, entities, programs, or activities are assigned to different conditions. There are appropriate controls to evaluate the effects of the condition of interest, with a preference for random assignment experiments or other designs to the extent that those designs contain within condition or across condition controls.
It also ensures that experimental studies are presented in sufficient detail and clarity to allow for replication or, at a minimum, offer the opportunity to build systematically on their findings. The approach also has been accepted by a peer-reviewed journal or approved by a panel of independent experts through a comparably rigorous, objective, and scientific review.
It's important to note here that practitioner journals or education magazines are not the same as peer-reviewed academic journals. The peer review reflects a much higher standard of rigor.
There's a lot involved for a teaching method to be considered a scientific, research-based intervention.
That's why it makes so much sense to us to think of children's responses to scientifically based interventions when implementing early intervening services. There is no explicit requirement to do so in either the law or the regulations. However, as a matter of practice, school staffs should rely on research-based methods when providing services to children who are having difficulty learning. It's the best way to help ensure the use of effective practices, and it is more likely the intervention will have the desired result of preventing children from developing the types of problems that need special education interventions.
And if the early intervening plans include a strong progress monitoring component, systematically collecting data around the achievement and behavior of children receiving these services, there will be a great deal of data for a team to consider in planning a full and individual evaluation for a child who is subsequently referred for evaluation for special education and related services.
Even though these are new concepts in the statute and regulations, it sounds as if there's a lot of information for schools to draw on in implementing them. Let's go back a minute to RTI. You mentioned, Lou, that it is only mentioned in the statute and regulations concerning evaluation of children for specific learning disabilities. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure, Juliet. In order to do that, I'm going to have to talk a bit about evaluation for specific learning disabilities. The regulations require that a state set the criteria for identifying a specific learning disability, and that the public agencies must use that criteria. There are some parameters around that criteria, including that it may not require the use of a severe discrepancy between IQ and a performance, must permit the use of a process based on the child's response to scientific research-based intervention, and may permit the use of other alternative research-based procedures for determining whether a child has a specific learning disability.
The evaluation also must consider whether the child does not achieve adequately for his or her age or achieve adequately to meet state-approved grade level standards when provided with learning experiences and instruction appropriate for the child's age or to meet the standards. The areas of consideration are the same areas that always have been considered for learning disabilities: oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skill, reading fluency skills, reading comprehension, mathematics calculation, mathematics problem solving.
There's a lot of reliance on data in determining the existence of a learning disability, and this emphasis is new in the revised IDEA statute and regulations. Teams must ensure that any underachievement is not due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math. There must be data to demonstrate that prior to or as part of the referral process, the child was provided appropriate instruction in regular education settings delivered by qualified personnel.
Before determining that a child has a significant learning disability, the team also must ensure that there is a data-based documentation of repeated assessments of achievement at reasonable intervals reflecting formal assessment of student progress during instruction. The results of these assessments must be provided to the child's parents.
And that brings us to the role of RTI in the evaluation process. If the child has participated in a process that assesses the child's response to scientific research-based intervention, RTI, the documentation of the eligibility determination must include documentation of the instructional strategies used and the student-centered data collected. The child's parents must be notified about the state's policies regarding the amount and nature of student performance data that would be collected and the general education services that would be provided. Strategies for increasing the child's rate of learning, and the parent's right to request an evaluation.
It's important to remember that RTI does not replace a comprehensive evaluation, and that evaluation teams must use a variety of data gathering tools and strategies, even if RTI is used. The results of RTI may be only one component of the information reviewed.
That's a critical point, Larry. The evaluation rules have not changed. A variety of assessment tools and strategies are to be used, and the evaluation cannot rely on a single procedure as the sole criterion for determining eligibility.
How long does RTI last? That is, how long must the child participate in RTI before the child can be referred for an evaluation?
I'm glad you asked that question, Juliet, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about it in the field. Keep in mind that children suspected of having a specific learning disability may participate in RTI as one of several evaluation components. To the extent that RTI is integrated in early intervening services or is provided to children as a support mechanism to alleviate learning problems, children already may be participating in RTI when the suspicion arises that the child may have a specific learning disability. Instructional models will vary in the frequency and in the number of repeated assessments that are required to determine a child's progress. So it would not be appropriate for the department to stipulate any particular time frame. There are many RTA models, and the department does not endorse or mandate any particular model.
The regulations require that public agencies must promptly request parental consent to evaluate a child to determine if the child needs special education and related services as soon as they suspect the child might have a disability under IDEA. Once the public agency has parental consent, it must complete an evaluation within 60 calendar days of receiving the consent or within the state's time frame if it has one.
Models based on RTI typically evaluate the child's response to instruction before the onset of the 60-day evaluation period. These models provide the data the group must consider on the child's progress when provided appropriate instruction by qualified professionals as part of the evaluation.
So, if I understand correctly, in the regulation, RTI is a provision cited only for the evaluation of children for determining whether they have a specific learning disability and that it must be permitted by states. Early intervening services is a separate provision to provide preventive support to children who are not yet identified as needing special education and related services. It makes sense to OSEP to connect RTI to early intervening services when such services are provided in order to help ensure the use of scientific, research-based interventions when providing early intervening services. And it provides a great deal of evaluative information about how individual children can learn.
That's exactly right, Juliet.
So let's talk a little more about early intervening services. What are the basics of this new provision, Larry?
As I mentioned earlier, the target group of children are those in kindergarten through grade 12, with an emphasis on children in kindergarten through grade 3. These children are not currently identified as needing special education and related services, but they need additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in the general education environment. A local educational agency, or LEA, can spend up to 15% of the federal funds it receives to provide early intervening services.
So, if a child has ever been identified as needing special education and related services, that child cannot receive early intervening services.
If a child has been so identified and is currently receiving special education and related services, the LEA could not also use IDEA funds to provide early intervening services to that child. However, if the child had been identified at one time and is no longer receiving special education and related services, if that child needs additional academic and behavioral support to succeed in the general education environment, federal IDEA funds up to that 15% cap could be used to provide early intervening services.
What can states do with the early intervening funds? That was 15% of their federal entitlement, correct?
15% is correct. They are not required to use up to 15%. They can use any amount they determine appropriate up to 15%. They can use those funds for professional development activities, and they can also use the funds for providing behavioral evaluations, services, and supports, including scientifically based literacy instruction.
That sounds like a lot like the kinds of activities that are provided as part of a free appropriate public education, or FAPE. What's the difference?
There is no entitlement to early intervening services. Whether or not an LEA chooses to provide early intervening services, FAPE remains an entitlement for children with disabilities under IDEA.
In addition, early intervening services cannot delay an appropriate evaluation of a child suspected of having a disability, and such services cannot be used to limit the provision of FAPE.
Early intervening services do not equate to FAPE because there is no special education decision-making process involved and that these children have not been evaluated as children with disabilities. Also, there is no individualized education program or IEP and no IEP team.
Another factor to consider, besides the relationship of early intervening services to FAPE, is the coordination of early intervening services with NCLB. Early intervening services funds may be used to carry out coordinated early intervening services that are aligned with activities funded by and carried out under NCLB.
The caveat here is that the early intervening service funds must be used to supplement funds made available under NCLB for the activities and services assisted under the early intervening services provisions, but cannot supplant those funds.
I think you just lost me. What does supplement, not supplant, mean?
If you are paying for certain services under NCLB, you can't stop paying for those services with NCLB funds and start paying for them with early intervening services funds. That would be supplanting. You can pay for additional services or allowable activities that supplement the NCLB funds with early intervening services funds. You can add more funds to the NCLB funds you are using from the early intervening services funds, but not take NCLB funds away and use early intervening services funds instead.
That's pretty clear. Are there rules about how states keep track of early intervening services?
There are reporting requirements. If LEAs choose to provide early intervening services, they must report both the number of children who received early intervening services under IDEA and report the number of children who received these services and who subsequently received special education and related services under Part B of IDEA during the 2-year period preceding the report.
That's a lot of new information. Have we covered the major provisions for early intervening services?
Larry, I think we need to talk about the relationship of early intervening services and the IDEA provisions around significant disproportionality.
That's right, Lou. It's an important provision related to early intervening services. In the case of a determination by a state that an LEA exhibits significant disproportionality on the basis of race or ethnicity in the identification of children with disabilities, including identification in specific disability categories, placement of children with disabilities in particular educational settings, or in the incidence, duration, or type of disciplinary actions, including suspensions and expulsions, the state must require the LEA to use the maximum amount of funds.
15%.
That's right, Lou. 15% to provide early intervening services to children in the LEA, particularly but not exclusively children in those groups that were significantly over-identified.
What is significantly over-identified?
Each state has the discretion to define the term for LEAs and for the state in general, and the state may determine statistically significant levels. An example of significant over-identification might be that in an LEA, 15% of the students are Hispanic, but 50% of the LEA's children with disabilities are Hispanic. Of course, this would depend on how the state defines significant disproportionality. We didn't establish a national standard for significant disproportionality because we recognize that there are mathematical factors, many of which are state-specific, that should go into making such determinations.
What are some of those factors?
Population size is one. Also, the size of individual LEAs and the composition of the state population.
There's also a connection between early intervening services and the requirements for financial maintenance of effort, or MOE. The state and local funds it puts toward the provision of special ed and related services.
That's right. The IDEA regulations include an Appendix D that provides some examples for states to use in calculating this relationship. An LEA can reduce its maintenance of effort by 50% of the amount its federal Part B allocation increases in a year. For example, if an LEA receives $1 million in federal funds in one year and the next year receives $2 million, that's an increase of $1 million. So the LEA can reduce the amount of state and local funds it puts into special education and related services, its maintenance of effort, by $500,000. 15% of the $2 million is $300,000 that is available for early intervening services. The LEA must reduce the amount available for early intervening services by the amount by which it chooses to reduce its maintenance of effort.
So, if the LEA reduces its state and local effort by $500,000, it may not use any federal funds for early intervening services.
That's right.
And if the LEA reduces MOE by $100,000 of the possible $500,000 reduction, it has $200,000 available for early intervening services.
That's right. You've got it, Juliet. First, the LEA must determine by how much, if at all, it may reduce maintenance of effort. Remember, that's 50% of the increase in its federal Part B funds from the previous year, and then compute the 15% of its total allocation that it can use for early intervening services. After that, the LEA must make a decision about how to allocate those funds, keeping in mind how the calculations affect one another. However, the LEA could first decide to use 15% for early intervening services. In that case, the amount used for those services reduces the amount that can be used for maintenance of effort reduction. The two processes, early intervening services and maintenance of effort, are interconnected.
Appendix D will help states understand how to do the math.
But let's go back to significant disproportionality for a moment. Does that affect an LEA's decision about how to use these funds and how to do the calculations?
It absolutely does. If the state identifies significant disproportionality by race or ethnicity in an LEA, the state must require the LEA to use the entire 15% for early intervening services. So maintenance of effort reduction can only occur after subtracting the 15% from the available maintenance of effort reduction.
It's not exactly a complicated concept, but it is very technical and detailed.
We agree, Juliet, and we think the interaction of the funding and the purpose of early intervening services addresses both maintenance of effort and significant disproportionality. And response intervention concepts and models are all interrelated and important provisions to support children in school success.
Thanks, Lou, and thank you, Larry. I appreciate your being here today to talk with us about these important provisions. This video is one in a series prepared by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, to assist our stakeholders in better understanding some of the significant provisions of the final regulations implementing IDEA 2004. We hope you found it helpful, and we thank you for your attention.